Hello,
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Dr. Natasha Tusikov. Am I saying that name right?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So my group member, he got to you about the audio documentary that we are doing on misinformation, and
Hmm.
I'll jump straight into the questions.
Sure.
What do you think is the definition of misinformation, and how can people know what is real and what is not?
That's a huge question that would depend on different countries' interpretations, whether you're talking from a legal perspective or a sociological perspective. I think maybe a common sense definition is information that is deliberately false, intentionally false, designed to mislead people.
Okay. So, how does misinformation impact the perception of individuals of any society about government and its policies?
Well, if we think about misinformation, the idea of deliberately false information or partisan information, which we often call disinformation, there's a very long history there of uh, opponents, rivals using misinformation to discredit government policies, to undermine confidence in government. So what we're seeing now is an adaptation of misinformation to a digital age, especially with social media. So a big difference we're seeing is the monetization of this misinformation, that you can post medical misinformation, for example, about COVID vaccines or the spread or mortality of COVID in a way that you're trying to seek popularity, right? Likes, or you're trying to seek advertising income. So this is a difference we're seeing now, and an added challenge for regulators trying to crack down on dangerous misinformation.
So, what are the parameters that help users filter out fake news from facts on social media?
Well, I guess as I would tell my students, know your source, right? Are you getting your medical information from some Facebook group, or are you getting it from, a doctor's office, some kind of medical agency, the government of Canada? So know your source. Be suspicious about what you see trending online. So often the social media platforms deliberately generate viral content. They game the system for certain content to go viral. So be suspicious. Always have your skeptical hat on when you're looking at information, and try and collaborate or corroborate, your sources, right? So instead of simply looking at something you get on Facebook, go to a reputable mainstream media outlet like the Globe and Mail or the Guardian or the New York Times, or a government website to check that.
Okay, can you tell us what's the impact of what you refer to as choke points on digital regulations?
So I call choke points. It describes a situation where we have big technology actors. These are internet intermediaries like payment, advertising, domain registrars, marketplaces. And these are the big players. They occupy a dominant place in the marketplace. And if they withdraw their services or deny their services to actors, it can be really hard to replace. So payment intermediaries is the best example here. If a website or an organization loses the ability to process payments through PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and a few others, they're really left with few commercial options. This means that these actors can deliberately starve a website or an organization of their ability to raise funds or generate any kind of revenue. So they're an excellent actor for governments to either partner with or coerce to act in government favor. And we saw this with the WikiLeaks attack in 2010, when the US government heavily threatened the intermediaries acting for WikiLeaks, the payment intermediaries, the cloud storage intermediaries, and pressured those intermediaries to withdraw their services from WikiLeaks in the absence of any formal legal charges, right? So it's simply state pressure instead of working through formal legal orders that we would in a democracy and according to rule of law, we would prefer, that would have more legitimacy.
Okay, so right now, how is Canada being affected by misinformation?
Well, if we just focus on the COVID pandemic, we know that there are many organizations and individuals who are deliberately spreading medical misinformation about the efficacy and safety of vaccines, masking, government efforts. Some people may honestly believe the information they're peddling, but there's also organizations that are deliberately making money from this, and they are causing a lot of problems because people get scared. They believe what they read online and they decide not to get vaccinated or not to have their children vaccinated. This is obviously incredibly problematic when we have a global health pandemic.
So just as you talked about COVID and the misinformation related to it, how do you think it is being addressed by the Canadian government? And how do you think the presented regulations affect the freedom of speech of Canada?
Well, governments in Canada, like those around the world, have reached out to social media companies. We have to remember these are American social media companies. So the government of Canada has very little influence over them. The only actors that are able to substantively influence these companies are American politicians. So Canadian politicians have reached out and have said, please endeavor as much as you can to reduce the worst, the most obvious medical misinformation. The challenge here is that the tech companies have little incentive to listen to Canada. In terms of regulating speech online, we already have all kinds of ways that we regulate speech. We regulate hate speech. We regulate the distribution of child sexual abuse images. That's prohibited. There's lots of different ways to regulate speech. Social media companies give us an added challenge because we're regulating user-generated speech, but user-generated speech that is already being regulated by the social media companies. So what we see on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok is not free speech. It is not completely organic speech that is just naturally being added by users. It is highly curated, highly regulated speech. The difference is it's being regulated by commercial actors for their for-profit reasons.
Okay. How big of a priority should misinformation be for the regulations that the government is trying to introduce? This is in
Of the
terms of
online
yes,
harms
yeah,
legislation?
yes, yes.
This is going to be a difficult issue. First of all, the government will have to define what it means by misinformation. I would imagine there would be obviously a prioritization of misinformation that is designed to harm in a physical way, designed to subvert democracy, destroy the integrity of a democratic system, that kind of thing. So first of all, a definition, which will be tricky, a prioritization of different types of misinformation with action being reserved for the most dangerous information, and then trying to figure out what actors should be responsible for identifying and policing this information. In the past, we've largely relied on the social media companies saying Facebook, Twitter, these other companies, YouTube is best placed to identify what constitutes extremism or hate speech. This is really problematic because their business models depend on a broad flow of information. So their business interests conflict with regulating speech, which means they're not going to be motivated to do so.
Yes. And what do you think about Bill C-10? And do you think it's going to affect the freedom of speech of the Canadians?
No, I don't. C-10 is a bill to moderate Canadian content online, right? So it's a bill that endeavors to promote Canadian content, and it's a part of Canada's cultural policy. So we already do this with radio, magazine, TV. This is a response of a small country and of a distinct culture or a series of cultures in regards to a large commercial dominant culture from the United States. So there is a lot of fear, there is a lot of angst and concern about this bill, but largely this is a bill that looks at new types of organizations like Spotify or YouTube and says, we should apply the same rules that our existing television, magazine, media industries already follow. So we're applying this to a series of new types of organizations. So it's controversial because it's the internet, and there's a broad idea that the internet should be a different type of actor and a different suite of rules should apply. But C10 sees a natural extension from media, television and radio to music streaming or video streaming.
Okay. If governments are already moving towards regulating misinformation on social platforms or online, why are some of the largest companies such as Facebook and Twitter still using the same algorithms that favor misinformation because of its engagement and not really addressing the issue?
Simply put, money. Right, so these are American companies, and their business model is based on the free flow of information. Free as in globally flowing information. Their business models are based on making sure that they have the most viewer engagement possible. So the information or content that generates the most clicks also generates the most value, because these companies are advertising companies. YouTube, Facebook generate most of their revenue from advertising. So they need to generate interesting, controversial, popular, viral content. They therefore have no economic incentive to put in place any measures that decreases user engagement, because it will cost them money. They have to be forced to do so by statutory intervention, right? So direct government intervention.
Okay, so what do you think is the future of social media giants like Facebook and Twitter when it comes to authenticity and transparency? Because we see that there's a growing concern now in people in terms of the information that they share, and how do you see these companies coming to terms with this kind of issue that they face from their users?
That's a very difficult question to answer. If I had a crystal ball, I'd be able to, write some articles and be famous in a couple of years. It's really difficult to predict. I would predict that in the next couple of years, we'll largely be in the same situation we are now. These companies are monopolist, right? They're dominant in their own sectors. They are impervious, it seems, to user concerns. They simply keep on doing what they're doing. They laugh off billion-dollar fines, right? They have so much money that they don't change their business models or their activities when they incur billion-dollar fines. So what will be needed to make them change? Quite a bit of direct government intervention. So the United States government can do this, for example, through anti-competition law, by breaking up Facebook and Instagram and its different companies, and importantly, at the same time, addressing the business model. Right? So saying you can't manipulate information in this way. You can't game your algorithms to maximize user engagement, because in doing so, you create this horrible effect of monetizing bad information. So short of direct government intervention, I don't see anything changing how these companies operate.
Okay, so right now, what do you think is the Canadian government doing to prevent the spread of misinformation? What measures is it taking right now at this very moment?
At this very moment right now, well, I hope that they're writing in a very thoughtful and open-minded way their draft legislation. I hope that they are planning to consult widely in terms of academics, industry experts, lawyers, privacy activists, users. Certainly, we don't have any rules on the books at the moment to protect against misinformation, unless it already falls in another criminal offense, right? So unless it's misinformation and hate speech, or if it's misinformation and child sexual abuse content, or something like that, misinformation and a privacy violation. So there's a lot riding on what this new online harms legislation will look like. It was a bit of a mess last time. It combined a lot of different and disparate types of offenses together. So hopefully it'll be a little more coherent this time.
Okay, and what are the topics that are often filled up with misinformation, and what do you think is the reason?
What are the topics?
Yeah, that are often influxed with misinformation, and what do you think could be the possible reason behind that?
Well, the topics that are most common for misinformation are the topics that we care about at the moment. So right now we're in the midst of a pandemic, so it's pandemic information. If we were involved in some type of war, it would be war. If it was going to be an election, it's an election, right? So we saw a rapid increase in electoral misinformation in the 2016 US presidential election, right? So you saw a lot of misinformation about the Democratic Party, about Hillary Clinton. So it's whatever is going on right now. I imagine there's also a lot of climate misinformation because this is something that a lot of people care about. We have high-level policy talks. So it's whatever issue is of the moment.
Okay, again, and going towards the social media outlets, do you think they're doing an effective job currently to address fake news, or does it show reasons for concern?
I'd say absolutely a reason for concern, and no, they're not doing nearly enough. We can look to what US policymakers get the social media companies to admit, because they are far better at making these companies admit things frankly when they're before the US Congress. And no, they're not very good. So we've had the companies admit that their algorithms are frankly poor at detecting problematic types of information. Facebook, for example, admitted that it only catches single digits in terms of hate speech. So we shouldn't be surprised about this, because their algorithms would not be used if their algorithms decreased user engagement, because that goes against their business model. So in many cases, what we're asking these companies to do goes against their economic interests. So we shouldn't be surprised when again and again and again, the companies tell us they're not very good at this, they don't want to do this, and every expose, every whistleblower shows they're not interested in doing this.
Okay, so we'll just wrap it up. And how do you think that digital transparency can help help stop the spread of misinformation?
I'm a little cynical about digital transparency, just like I'm a bit cynical about digital literacy initiatives. We know a lot already. So when the recent Facebook whistleblower disclosed the documents, it was worldwide coverage and got a lot of public and policymaker attention, and that's good, except many of the things that were disclosed were already known. Right, so we already have a lot of knowledge. We already have a lot of research, a lot of leaked documents. The problem is we're not acting on them. The right people aren't acting on them, and we're not taking them seriously, in part because we have this fear that regulating technology companies is censorship, right? That anything we do to touch this free flow of information, this US style free speech, will be censorship. And that's not true. We regulate all kinds of companies in different ways. And these social media companies have proven that they're bad actors, that they repeatedly violate laws, that they repeatedly are poor self-regulators, and that they cause a lot of serious problems in society.
Okay, so the need of the hour is to, formulate laws and then to implement them. That is.
Yeah, and it's going to be difficult, right? Because we saw with the current debate with C10, we saw with the Online Harms Act, we didn't have a detailed, nuanced, thoughtful discussion of the provisions in Canada. We had a pretty knee-jerk reaction with a lot of opponents saying, this is censorship, this is akin to Chinese authoritarian regulation, this is terrible, it's the worst thing ever. That doesn't make for good public policy debates, right? We should really be thinking about this carefully and thoughtfully and saying, what are the best ways we can do this? Yes, of course, the Online Harms Bill was a bit of a mess, but it wasn't anything like an authoritarian bill that would be considered in Russia. So we have to pull back on the rhetoric a bit and think about this carefully and in a kind of a calm and collected way.
Okay, there is a way, but we haven't reached there yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful talking to you. You explained everything so nicely, and I really enjoyed this conversation. It was very enlightening for me.
Excellent.
And
Me too.
when we are done, we'll definitely share the audio documentary with you, and you can.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. Thank
All
you
right.
for your time.
Take care and best of luck with the project.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a nice
Bye.
day.
You too.
Bye.